Our protagonist asks Lu how's that possible? Or egos that common? What our protagonist have been doing for 5 years, then? Lu says that's because master is an idiot. Our protagonist asks what? Lu cover himself saying nothing master. Just look for the ego. It's here somewhere. Because of the dust covers around the room our protagonist can't see anything and coughs. Our protagonist says this gate is too old. He doubt that there's anything left, much less a hidden piece. And our protagonist eyes surprise. Lu says that he's telling our protagonist, he think there's an ego here. But our protagonist already saw the white beautiful sword in front of him. Our protagonist says what's this Excalibur, it's something. He should grab it right and hold the sword with his 2 hands. From the sword gem a radiant glow appears. It emits again a large amount of bright light. Just like Lu, this sword also asks are you my master? Our protagonist looks it. Our protagonist thinks looking at his hands a space filled with pure white. It's similar to when our protagonist met Lu, but now it feels different. Our protagonist asks are you the ego contained in the sword? Sword replies yes, it have been waiting for a master. It further asks will you respond to my calling? Our protagonist says I'm your master yet. But he'd like to be that sword master. That sword thinks and says then choose a name for sword. Our protagonist names that sword as L. From now on your name is L. Now scene changes and that sword holding by our protagonist. Our protagonist thinks he didn't feel as unfamiliar this second time. Since he already expired it once. Suddenly there's a moment occurs. Our protagonist looks up and find out that ceiling is getting cracks. Pieces from the ceiling falling down. Lu says to our protagonist to run. L also says our protagonist run. Our protagonist says I know. Lu asks who are you? L says who's asking? Lu says I'm the greatest distinguished ego. Our protagonist order both of them to be quiet. On the other side dungeon collapsing. Our protagonist says the Talon's corpse. And thinks have got to move to the rewards room. All of a sudden floor also starts collapsing. Our protagonist barely able to touch the Baron's corpse. And system says do you wish to move to the rewards room? Our protagonist says quick. With the help of the system he's moving to the rewards room while he was transferring a white fog covers our protagonist. It fully covers our protagonist. Our protagonist saw a big eye looks at our protagonist. Our protagonist was surprised to seeing that godly existence. News as a sustained gate was demolished. No precedent. Cause unknown. The timing of the freak accident overlapping with the timing of mass gate formations caused great debate for a while. On the bright side, because the gate collapsed way after our protagonist left, so our protagonist was not regarded as a suspect. Its clear rewards were 30 violet crystals and an addition reward, Charm of Protection. Charm of Protection, a valuable item that prevents common illnesses and increases longevity, and can be used even by ordinary people. Though it wasn't enough to cure our protagonist's mother's illness, it's helpful in the money our protagonist received from selling the crystals allowed him to move her mother into a hospital, and it's may our protagonist feels a little better. After our protagonist decided to climb the tower once again, now scene changes to 5th floor. Our protagonist did hear that the floor of the test was quite developed, due to the absence of monsters, but our protagonist thinks this is basically a normal city. And progressed past the 5th floor, where our protagonist had been found unconscious, as well as, and now the scene changes to 6th floor and our protagonist starts slaughtering the monsters. And now changes to 7th floor, right after that it changes to 8th floor. And 9th floor. Our protagonist says that he couldn't even dream of coming here, until recently. Your level itself isn't actually what's important. Because as long as you didn't give up, your unique ability will eventually manifest. And these words are said by none other than Sioku, who trained our protagonist at first when our protagonist was awakened as hunter. Our protagonist thinks now Sioku too was right. Now our protagonist have 2 rings in his fingers, those are Lu and L. Our protagonist says L leveled up quite a bit, too. Because of the shared experience, leveling up is a little slower, but, thanks to synchronization, our protagonist can definitely feel himself growing stronger. Our protagonist thought it would be incredibly powerful, because it supposedly had a demon sealed within it, but the demon was sealed within him for so long that all the power has dissipated. About the demon he was sorry. He just didn't remember. Well, I don't know to what our protagonist was talking. Our protagonist thinks was the demon that giant eye. And our protagonist further thinks, well, it seems for sure that he can grow more powerful, the more egos our protagonist have. Our protagonist thinks he guess have gotta look for more egos. Lu asks our protagonist, you know where to look. Our protagonist says he know a place. It's item auction house. Scene changes too. In auction house, bidding was going on and our protagonist asks Lu, you sense anything? Lu and L both says no. Our protagonist thinks in his head he should have known. There's no way egos are so common. Now the auctioneer says the last item of the day. And that the main item of the auction. The bracelet of the wounded. Someone says it was an item that supposed should increase one's regeneration up. Lu and L both suddenly daze ego. Our protagonist one's surprised to hear that. And now scene changes and our protagonist says he didn't know auctions are so tiring. Why's everything so expensive? Our protagonist was so tired it shows in his face. L says there was no way around it since it was the main item to master. Lu says master ia poor. Our protagonist says well, at least the dagger of paralysis sold for a whopping $100,000. And gives a weird smile. Lu says master expression weird. Our protagonist with creepy smile, Lu, L let me give you a kiss. Lu says to our protagonist, are you crazy? L only says master. Our protagonist buys something in supermarket, and talks with someone on home that he's on his way home now. Any problems? No, our protagonist says he don't have any, and suddenly says there is just one problem. That is it's hard to find a party. And further says he got back from a gate a while ago, and the players were a bigger problem than the monsters. That person who's talking on phone yells loudly at our protagonist like what? You went into a gate. He told our protagonist to be careful for the time being. Now we understand that the person our protagonist was talking with is Taeshik. Our protagonist says it's an F-rank gate. And our protagonist further says he know that our protagonist just a level 1 without his equipment. Our protagonist can't get a player ranking, which means he can't solo raids. Our protagonist know that he can't do anything about it. And says I'll see you soon, and further says our protagonist, oh you don't forget, Taeshik told our protagonist he'd take our protagonist out to eat, to celebrate Taeshik promotion. Still talking, it's not like our protagonist don't enjoying climbing the tower, but Lu has to absorb the blood as well, so the pace is slow. And the rewards from the gate last time were good, too. Call ends here. Our protagonist says he's sure it'll work out, one way or the other. And further says have taken care of, that's urgent. And our protagonist able to buy beef to eat. L says how humble of you, even after acquiring such a large sum of money. Lu says more like stingy. Our protagonist says Lu, how has it been some? He beat some sense into Lu, again. Lu apologies to our protagonist. Anyway, our protagonist wants to earn a lot of money and move somewhere else, as soon as possible. He'd like for Yu Jung, it's our protagonist's sister, to be able to walk around more safely, too. While our protagonist is waiting, something caught his attention in front our protagonist. There's a lifting appears. It glows suddenly so high and bigger, and that light turns into a gate. Gate formation protocol. 1 Steradian remain calm. A gate that just been formed is not dangerous. Keep watch over the situation. After calling 112, or the association. 2nd, keep your distance. Entering a gate of unknown rank is dangerous. Even if you're a player, entering a gate without the verification of the association will result in a sentence up to 5 years, or a fine of up to $10,000. 3rd, gather solid proof. In the event that there are multiple witnesses present prior to the association's verification, it is possible for conflict to arise. If you witness an incident while you're alone, leave evidence. Priority gate access and privilege will be given to the first to find it. These rules is remade by South Korea's Association Gate Supervision Department. Now scene changes to Taeshik. He was checking something in his computer. He was checking the gate that appeared in front of our protagonist and thinks it's near Gigyu's house. Taeshik reading the report was made by, and I think Taeshik saw something he can't and spilled a coffee. And calls out our protagonist name loud. Gigyu Kim staff was clueless. Neither us. Now scene changes to somewhere and someone saying in the event you do not enter the gate within 5 days, your rights to clear the gate will forfeited, and auctioned. There are other conditions aside from this, too, so keep that in mind. Thank you again for your fast report. It was an officer that he was talking with our protagonist. That officer noticed Taeshik coming and calls sir. Taeshik asks that officer, are you done? Taeshik says to our protagonist Gigyu, let's have a talk. Our protagonist agrees. Now scene changes to coffee shop. Our protagonist asks, isn't that coffee is too sweet? Taeshik says it's not that sweet. Coffee's all about the syrup, man. Taeshik drinks that coffee in one gulp. Taeshik asks our protagonist, it just so happens to be an F-ranked gate, huh? You planning on clearing it right? Taeshik asks our protagonist that he's confident. Our protagonist with smile says yup. Come on, now. Taeshik shouldn't underestimate our protagonist. Now our protagonist a lot stronger now. Taeshik says we'll know about that, but he know that our protagonist stubborn, that's for sure. Our protagonist laughs, ha ha ha. Stop laughing you damn think by Taeshik. Taeshik asks our protagonist which floor our protagonist at now. Our protagonist says 11th, he cleared the 10th floor today. And Taeshik asks in your level. Our protagonist says that he already know that. Taeshik suddenly says 4 days. Our protagonist don't know he was saying about. Taeshik again says finish your preparations within 4 days. And after that come to him. Our protagonist asks why. Taeshik says he wants to see if our protagonist be okay to go in. And further says if our protagonist not well prepared, he won't let our protagonist enters the gate. No matter what. Now the scene changes to 4 days later. Our protagonist says he doesn't know something like this existed in their building basement. Taeshik says it's a training room. It just isn't much used these days. Our protagonist thinks space expanse with protective barrier around the wall, too. Our protagonist thinks have been underestimating the association. Taeshik suddenly asks our protagonist what does he think, does this spark our protagonist interest at all? Our protagonist remains silent. Taeshik says to our protagonist having a position within the association. He don't think it'd be bad for our protagonist to join as an agent or some other positions, now. Our protagonist replies to that thanks for the offer, but he's going to have to refuse. Our protagonist don't want to settle down anywhere quite yet. Taeshik says is that so? Our protagonist will always welcome here, so just say the word. Our protagonist asks Taeshik about Tayo. The guide department disappeared when Taeshik got promoted, didn't it? Taeshik says the Caravan Guild. Taeshik thinks where Tayo joined. Tayo now a completely different person than the stoic kid Taeshik knew. Our protagonist says that's great. He'll have to meet up with Tayo sometime. Our protagonist never heard of that guild before though. Our protagonist asks Taeshik, you said we're sparring, aren't Taeshik going to get a weapon? Taeshik says what? Geez. It seems like you're looking down on me because have been too busy just doing office work these days. Taeshik casually flinch his fist on air towards our protagonist. It was so powerful our protagonist have to cover himself. Taeshik says once an expert, always an expert. Don't underestimate a former high ranker. Taeshik aura suddenly changes. Taeshik says to our protagonist stop messing around and bring it on. Our protagonist thinks in his head that he knows he can't beat Taeshik. Our protagonist says to Taeshik he'll be learning a thing or two, then. Our protagonist thinks in his head he won't go down without a fight. In a second our protagonist surprise. Because Taeshik foot came towards our protagonist head. With difficulty our protagonist blocks it. And our protagonist thrown quite a far away. Taeshik asks our protagonist, are you sure? Our protagonist came prepared. Our protagonist thinks a high ranker's a high ranker after all. It reminds Seoku to our protagonist. Taeshik with angry expression says to our protagonist, focus. Letting your guard down in the gate is the same as dying. Our protagonist thinks Taeshik is right, he was too kooky. And our protagonist further thinks he didn't came without a plan. Now scene changes to 4 days ago, Dongseeman District Player Item Auction Market. Lu asks item. What for? There are no items better than us, boss. Our protagonist pretend like he was talking on the phone but he's not. Our protagonist says it's not like that. He don't have any good armor at all. Our protagonist just go around like this forever. And who knows, maybe he'll find an ego. L. Says to our protagonist she will let our protagonist know as soon as she senses one nearby master. Our protagonist says alright, let's go look around. While he was walking on the roadside, a armor caught our protagonist's eye. That armor inept blacksmith's crappy metal armor. Rarity, normal, effects, increased defense by 9. And he further looks around but he can't find any egos, but the price tag was so high it's widen our protagonist's eyes. Our protagonist walks around the streets like that he can't find anything good. Lu, L, and our protagonist both are dissatisfied today's explore. Our protagonist says the cheap ones are disgusting bad, and the good ones are disgustingly expensive. This isn't easy. While our protagonist was thinking like this, Lu and L calls our protagonist. Our protagonist looks at the street. There is something commotion going on. It's between a man and a little child. That little child says to that man, "That's not true. My grandpa's an amazing artisan." That man says to that child, "What's so amazing about equipment whose item information doesn't even pop up?" That little boy says, "You're wrong. My grandpa's really good." That man says to the child, "What's the point in advertising a store that won't even do business properly? Even if he go, he'll just get kicked out again." That child gets annoyed. That time our protagonist calls that kid. That boy turned around our protagonist. Our protagonist asks that boy, will he lead the way for him to your grandpa's store? That little boy once became silent and after that agrees to it with joy. That boy leads our protagonist to his grandpa's store. Our protagonist asks Lu and L, "Are you sure?" They both say, "Yes master, no doubt." Lu says the clothes that kid has on, they're all egos. L says it's artificially made by a human, but it partially wields the strength of an ego, for certain. Lu says to Ellie, "Stop saying what I wanna say, damn it." That boy with a joyful face calls his grandpa saying that he brought a customer. That boy name is Minsu. His grandpa says to that boy, "Didn't he tell him not to bring guests?" But the boy says that he want everyone to know about you, grandpa. You have lots of nice clothes, too. Why are you wearing the one he made? Your father would be pissed if he saw this. One smells nice. Our protagonist was speechless after looking into the room. Not only our protagonist, Lu and L too. L says everything. Our protagonist thinks everything in here, they're all egos. L says, "No way, there are so many egos. In the store every item is plus 30. Lu says they're all missing a pair. They're all egoless, egos. Our protagonist asks, "Isn't ego also ego in English?" Our protagonist looks at the store. That's child grandpa present in front of our protagonist. He says he nothing to sell, so just leave. That grandpa says that he don't have any plans on selling to someone who doesn't even know their value. He further says it's not the first time have met guys like our protagonist who can't even appreciate his work. This grandpa named Yuchul Wong Blacksmith. Our protagonist says he'll buy. That grandpa says to our protagonist he already told he wasn't selling. Guys like you won't be able to use anyways. Our protagonist asks that blacksmith if he can use them, will he sell them to our protagonist. Blacksmith says to our protagonist, "Don't be ridiculous and just leave." Our protagonist picks a sword I think and says nameless sword, level 79, abilities are. Blacksmith surprised that he can see that weapon status. Blacksmith asks our protagonist, "Don't tell him. You can see the sword's abilities." Our protagonist says, "Of course, you can as well, right sir?" asked by our protagonist. Blacksmith was speechless. Blacksmith asks our protagonist, "Go ahead and try using it. To have a person who knows the value of their weapon. Wield it. That is a blacksmith's greatest wish." Our protagonist thinks a second and says, "From now on your name is Sharpness." After hearing that our protagonist giving a name to that sword, it really surprised the blacksmith. Not only the blacksmith, the child who brought our protagonist to this store too. An awkward moment, nothing happened, and our protagonist holds the sword in air. L says to our protagonist, "It looks like it didn't like the name." Our protagonist says, "Is that why?" Now scene changes to the present where Taeshik and our protagonist was sparring. From our protagonist's eyes red flame comes out. With lightning speed he rushed forward to attack with his two swords. Taeshik remains stand where he is at without moving. Taeshik blocked the attack without moving with his bare hands. Taeshik says to our protagonist with a fierce face, he still see our protagonist hesitation at the tip of our protagonist's sword. "Aim for the vital spot with all your strength." Taeshik asks our protagonist, does he even think he'll be able to put a scratch on him like this? Our protagonist thinks in his head, my opponent is a former high ranker. He says himself that he have to concentrate and once again attacks, but Taeshik dodges it. Our protagonist attack Taeshik again and again and again, but he can't able to leave scratch and Taeshik blocking every attack our protagonist with ease. Taeshik throw a lunge at our protagonist dodge and attacks Taeshik, but Taeshik again dodges it. Their sparring like this continues for a while. After that Taeshik with fierce face throws a punch at our protagonist. Our protagonist can't able to dodge it, so Taeshik hits our protagonist in his stomach. Now again scene changes, our protagonist says why can't he link with any of them? Is this really an ego? Lu says to our protagonist these guys are second rate, not only that, but egos are usually super picky about their owners. Lu further says it couldn't be helped with L and him, but don't think that all of them will be like L and him. L says to our protagonist I like you master. Even an ego saying that I like you. Our protagonist says to them he'll try one last time. Lu says to our protagonist Che. Give up, human. Our protagonist says with hesitation your name is Brunhard. Suddenly it glows. Notification window appears like you have linked with ego Brunhard. Our protagonist was happy because it worked. It goes into our protagonist body. Notification window appears saying partner lacks the ability to wield it, so not all the abilities can be used. Brunhard loses most of its abilities. Brunhard level 7. Strength 15. Agility 3. Stamina 40. Magic power 6. Skill accessorize, reflect defense 12. Now scene changes again where our protagonist was sparring when Taeshik was trying to hit our protagonist's stomach. Brunhard's skill uses reflecting damage accumulated by Brunhard. When Taeshik punched, a sudden blast occurs. Our protagonist was thrown far away, hits the wall and vomit the blood. Our protagonist fell down on ground. Taeshik throw a bottle towards our protagonist and says drink. It's a potion for internal injuries. Our protagonist with chuckle smile says seriously. My hands are shaking so he can't even open it. Taeshik says to our protagonist you pass. It quite confused to our protagonist and asks what. Taeshik says he's telling that our protagonist passed. Taeshik says he didn't think our protagonist would actually be able to give him a scratch, but our protagonist thinks in his back a thoroughly planned strategy that wasn't a coincidence. Our protagonist thinks was it he who took this too lightly. Taeshik asks our protagonist what was that earlier. Our protagonist with a proudly says it's from his item, of course. Taeshik says to our protagonist that if the gate isn't cleared a week from today then the association will send their agents. Now that he wish our protagonist the best of luck in clearing the gate. Taeshik says to our protagonist that he's giving our protagonist 5 days, not a week. If our protagonist don't come out within that time, forget the agents, he's the one going to go in himself and drag our protagonist out. Our protagonist says you don't have to. Taeshik says it's cheaper than paying for the agent's travel expenses. Taeshik asks our protagonist that he did packs his potions and food. Our protagonist says he did. And Taeshik further asks our protagonist what about smoke bombs. Our protagonist says of course he did. Taeshik says to our protagonist don't be cocky just cause it's an F rank. Our protagonist says okay. Lu says to our protagonist isn't it similar level to the one with the zombies? Why is he making such a fuss? It's not like that dangerous. Our protagonist says he's like a rather to him. He's probably just worried. Our protagonist says to Taeshik he'll be back. Taeshik says okay. Our protagonist enters into the gate. And system says you have entered the gate. Our protagonist says that he's hoping it's a sudden gate. Lu asks our protagonist what's good about that. Our protagonist says he can earn a lot of money. Lu asks again our protagonist how do he know if it's a sustained gate or not. Our protagonist says he have to clear it first. Since this is an F rank there's a high chance of it being the difficulty tower or basement gate. As long as it isn't the maze gate then he'll be able to clear it quickly. Well anyway our protagonist summons Lu. That time a monster attacks our protagonist, he killed it with a swing. Our protagonist says let's end this small talk for now. Our protagonist turns around, there's a lot of monsters there hidden under the dark. Our protagonist says it's time to level up. Our protagonist cuts the wolf into 2 pieces and Lu absorbs the blue wolf's blood. Our protagonist with his 2 swords holding in his hand he charges towards the wolf. Cell has level up. A wolf almost bite our protagonist the waist. Our protagonist makes his face like he can't help with it but suddenly smile. When that wolf about to bite our protagonist waist. Brunhard's skill was activated. reflecting damage accumulated by Brunhart. But it destroys. After that, our protagonist use Lu's abilities and Brunhart abilities to kill the monsters. Our protagonist says let's take break. Lu says humans. Our protagonist says it's been around 5 hours. Is it because it's an F rank? There isn't much of a difference between the orcs, if anything it feels easy. Still, with our protagonist position, it would have been hard for him to enter on his own, but he got lucky this time. Our protagonist feels like he'll definitely need a player rank, but a player's rank is measured without any equipment. If our protagonist more than a certain distance away from his ego, then he'll have level 1 abilities. There's no way our protagonist could get a proper evaluation. There's nothing Taeshik Hung can do for our protagonist either. L says one's master's abilities advance no matter how far apart they're. Our protagonist should be able to maintain the link. Our protagonist says he hopes so, but he don't even know that he's supposed to do advance. Lu says to our protagonist ego leech. Our protagonist hit Lu. Our protagonist says to Lu he'll hit him. Lu says that he hit him already. Our protagonist says well, in adding to not knowing how to advance. He don't get this either. Lu level 17. Strength 40. Agility 54. Strength 50. Magic power 34. Skill accessorize. Cannibalism. Our protagonist says cannibalism, this is that, right? Eating one's own kind. Could it be that you? Lu gets angry and says are you crazy human? Our protagonist says that he's just joking around. And further says have rested enough now, so time to go. Our protagonist thinks his bag is already full to the brink. Filled with smoke bomb, healing potions. And further thinks should he buy a bag with enlargement magic placed on it. Our protagonist caught something in his bag that is buff potions. If he drink these he should have more space. He needed buffs anyway. In front of our protagonist there's a strong energy came towards him. Lu says to our protagonist he feel the strongest energy within the gate. The boss is probably there. Our protagonist while drinking the buffs potions he knows that. That's what he's drinking, these buffs potions for now. Our protagonist says he's almost there. At this rate, he'll lose all the effects from the potions he drank earlier. Elle says that she's feeling a strong energy from somewhere nearby. Lu says that he's certain that they're almost there. Our protagonist says there's light. We must be almost there like Elle said. Lu says I'm GH1 who said it. Our protagonist quite down. Lu says no one can hear them anyways. Our protagonist agrees. Elle says to Lu, stop being rude to master. Lu angrily says mind your own business. How pretentious. Our protagonist thinks a presence that feels as if it has swallowed more than half of the gate's power. Unlike Talon, who had been attacked countless times, this one has the true dignity of a monster was sleeping in this cave-like place. It opens its eyes after our protagonist enters this place. It's the gatekeeper of the tower. Lu says to our protagonist wow, that's impressive. Elle says to our protagonist be careful master. Pressure that is leagues above Talon's. Our protagonist was ready to with his 2 swords. And thinks so this is a real boss monster. That gatekeeper with high speed run towards our protagonist. Our protagonist was ready to face the gatekeeper with his 2 ego swords. That gatekeeper rushed towards our protagonist. Our protagonist blocks the attack with his swords. And counter-attacks it. Our protagonist able to stab the monster jaw and thinks it's shallow. Gatekeeper with red eyes gets angry, moves towards our protagonist with lightning speed. Our protagonist dodging it. Our protagonist thinks his defense is stronger than it looks. Our protagonist have no choice but to have it slowly accumulate damage. Our protagonist suddenly smirk and thinks not bad. Fighting a tough opponent is actually our protagonist's speciality. Drops the bag, rush to the gatekeeper to attack. The fight between our protagonist and gatekeeper runs fiercely. Gatekeeper attacks our protagonist with its sharp teeth. Our protagonist blocking with his swords. Hardly. Our protagonist once again stab with his sword. And once more battle between them heated. Our protagonist takes damage from the gatekeeper. Our protagonist got wounded now. That gatekeeper wolf once again attacks our protagonist. Now scene changes that wolf gatekeeper can't able to move and of course it's still alive. Our protagonist says that was a close call. The effects from the buff potions were almost up and if he didn't have Brunhart, our protagonist would have lost the battle. Our protagonist looking at the wolf gatekeeper says he can't even compare Talon to him. That gatekeeper looks at our protagonist. Our protagonist says while raise his sword thanks for dying by his hands. And our protagonist kills the gatekeeper wolf. Notifications: you have defeated the gate's boss, Changkyung. You've gained experience. Lu absorbs Changkyung blood. Lu gained an agility stat from absorbing Changkyung's blood. Lu gained a skill from absorbing Changkyung's blood. Strong will. Stamina recovers at a rapid pace when dealt with damage that is difficulty to withstand. System says cannibalism has been activated. Seeing all, our protagonist was really surprised. System says cannibalism has been activated. Our protagonist killed that wolf, that blood spattered around the ground. Our protagonist looks at the gatekeeper wolf. Suddenly a big mouth appears in front of our protagonist and it's devour the gatekeeper wolf. And it was Lu's doing. Notification window appears that Lu has absorbed Changkyung. You have successfully transformed Changkyung into an ego. Our protagonist asks what's going on. And for killing the gatekeeper wolf, that essential stone drops from the air. Lu says to our protagonist, he don't you either. Have never heard of turning a monster into an ego. Our protagonist says he guess it would be faster for him to look into it. Our protagonist asks what about you Elle? Elle says to our protagonist she's the same. She's sorry that she can't be of any help to our protagonist. Our protagonist says really? Lu says why did you only say something to me? Our protagonist says ego transformation, does that mean Lu has Changkyung's ego? Lu says to our protagonist no, he don't have anything. Are you listening to him? Our protagonist asks Lu because he doesn't know what's going on. Our protagonist says then what's going on? Elle doesn't have this skill to begin with, so our protagonist calls information window. Name Gigyu Kim. Job ego's partner. Unique ability link. Skill synchronize. Acquired ego, Changkyung. Our protagonist surprised because that skill have our protagonist. Our protagonist thinks how did he use this? Our protagonist says do he have to yell the skill name? Like the past when he do this thing to summon Lu. Our protagonist is clueless. Our protagonist says he'll try it later. He'll know when the time comes. Lu and Elle are clueless too. Our protagonist says we were able to check the usefulness of cannibalism and he happy that he is able to get his hands on a blue crystal that's one rank above a purple crystal. And for a size like this, he can get a pretty good price for it. Now time to go to the rewards room. Our protagonist walks towards rewards room and he was once again clueless. Because something is missing, it's not here. Lu and Elle asks our protagonist what's wrong. Our protagonist explained to them to go into the rewards room he have to touch the gatekeeper's body, but our protagonist screams that Lu ate Changkyung's corpse. Lu says why is it always him? Inside the gate where the sun never sets, our protagonist did pledged search from the second day. I think our protagonist was looking for a way to rewards room. Because since disappearance of gatekeeper wolf's body there no way he can reach it. Lu says to our protagonist do you really have to find it? Aren't you wasting time? Our protagonist was looking for something. Elle says going outside to get some help could be one method. Our protagonist says he can't do that. If there's an anomaly like last time at the Guri city gate then they'll start questioning him. And if he can't find a way to clear it, even if he go outside, then a gate break will occur and there'll be a lot of casualties. He have to finish what he started. He think he's the cause so he have to figure out a way no matter what. Elle says to our protagonist she's moved by our protagonist's sense of responsibility. Our protagonist feels proud himself. Loi says that's a nice way to put it, but aren't you just saying that you'll clean up the mess you made? Our protagonist gets annoyed and says be quiet. Taeshik Yun will come after 4 days so they'll be able to avoid the worst case scenario. Lu says that human was definitely impressive. Our protagonist says of course it would be best if we could resolve this before then. Now scene changes to day 3. Our protagonist searched all over the meadow but he couldn't find anything. Our protagonist says should they just kill off all the remaining monsters? Elle says she think that's a good idea. Lu says he thinks that's too simple but it isn't a bad idea. They went through the tunnels that they had purposely avoided before one by one. They wiped out the remaining blue wolves. Now scene changes to day 5. They're still hunting. Our protagonist says this should be the last one. Elle says good work master. Our protagonist says what now? Taeshik Hung should be here soon. Our protagonist says died he have to break the cave or something. Elle and Lu both calls our protagonist master. Our protagonist noticed something. Lu says all of the gate energy is L says gathering in one place. Our protagonist was surprised to see that kind of thing, it never happened before. Our protagonist asks where is that? Lu says where the gatekeeper was. L says the meadows. Now scene changes, I think it's Taeshik says to our protagonist if he came out an hour later he would have gone in. Their discussion room blocks with soundproof barrier generator. Our protagonist laughs, haha. That was close. Taeshik asks our protagonist why were you late? Taeshik thought with our protagonist's skills he should have been able to finish it in 2 days. Our protagonist says to Taeshik to tell him the truth, he defeated the keeper on the first day. But there was a problem, so Taeshik asks a problem. Why would be any problems after defeating the boss? Our protagonist says the boss's body disappeared. So he couldn't be transported to the rewards room. Taeshik was so surprised to hearing it. Taeshik asks our protagonist so what did he do? Our protagonist replied to Taeshik that he killed all of the remaining monsters. Taeshik says so that's why our protagonist had so many crystals. He brought it over in his hood like it was a treasure. Our protagonist continues the conversation. Anyways, after he killed the last one all the energy in the gate gathered in the boss room. Now scene changes, Lu and L says to our protagonist to hurry. Our protagonist says he's running as fast as he can. Our protagonist enter into the boss room, the scene our protagonist that he saw, then how should he describe it? Our protagonist was shocked. Because it was almost as if the world was breaking into pieces and being crumpled into one place. That energy gathers into one place. After absorbing all energy, a spherical shaped glowing ball fall into our protagonist's hands. Notification window appears, you have acquired an ego fragment. Will you go to the reward room? Now again scene changes, Taeshik asks our protagonist what are you talking about? Our protagonist became quiet, and after says he think the gates might be egos. Taeshik totally surprised this time.